Thanks, Julian. I'll be very brief. I just want to try to put today's conference in the context of the broader education debate as we see it. I think this is a very interesting moment in education debate. That's the broad education debate, not the specific debate we're obsessed with at the beginning of the week, which is about parents going to incredible lengths to get their children into the schools that they've got their eye on. I caused enormous anger yesterday by going on the Today programme and suggesting that possibly there was an element of hysteria amongst parents in relation to this process, and pointing out that in relation to this idea of good schools and bad schools, that my own younger son goes to a school in South London called Lillian Baylis, which he's very much enjoying and he's doing very well in. This is the school that Oliver Letwin said, and I quote 5 years ago, he said, "I would rather beg on the streets than send my children to the local school." This is a school that's gone from fewer than 10% of children getting 5 A to Cs to well over 50% in that period of time. So, strange debate, this notion that there are good schools and they're forever good schools, and there are bad schools and they're forever bad schools, and all parents have got to do is try and get their children to the good schools. It's a very peculiar kind of debate, and it's a pity that our politicians pander to it. Anyway, moving on. Why I think this is an interesting moment in the education debate is because there seems to be, on the one hand, a kind of growing consensus around a new agenda, or a kind of new space anyway, which comes after the centralising standards agenda of the last 20 years. On the other hand, there is also some momentum behind one of those kind of periodic back-to-basics drives that we have seen as a characteristic of the British education debate, the English education debate, going right back, well, for decades and decades, but certainly back to Plowden. Now, the outcome of that debate, do we move to a kind of post-centralising standards agenda, which I'll say more about in a moment, or is there this kind of knee-jerk back-to-basics response? That will be partly determined by who's in government next year and the decisions of that government, but it will also, in our view, be determined by the quality of thinking and the quality of practice of those who are broadly committed to what might be called, if you excuse me using a lazy terminology, a kind of innovative, progressive approach to the curriculum. So in many ways, our practice will help to shape which way that kind of debate goes. As Julian said, Opening Minds began about 9 years ago, and then, of course, it was incredibly different to the national curriculum. It was, at that stage, a radical proposition to suggest that one might place subjects in the framework of skills or competencies, rather than skills in a framework of subjects. But, of course, as you all know, the world has moved on since then. The national curriculum at secondary level is changing, has changed. It's gradually coming to recognise the value of local innovation, of teachers having the freedom to design aspects of the curriculum to suit their students. Moreover, there has been a gradual recognition of the need to turn out capable, confident individuals as well as young people with a fistful of qualifications. With Sir Jim Rose's review earlier this year, it became clear that the primary curriculum is set to follow suit, with broad areas of learning rather than rigidly defined subjects, an emphasis on making links across learning, and a more coherent account of the kinds of skills and capabilities children need to access and make the most of what they're learning. And despite genuine substantive differences, and fascinating differences, between Sir Jim Rose's approach and the approach in the Cambridge Primary Review and the Select Committee Review, I'm delighted to have Barry Shearman here today. Nevertheless, I would argue that there is, as I say, a broad area, at least, of consensus across those pieces of work. But, as I say, this debate is far from over. The Conservative Party are the bookies' favourite to win the general election next year. And there is an interesting kind of tension within Conservative policy. On the one hand, Michael Gove has indicated that the Conservative government will be in favour of schools having more freedom. On the other hand, they have a profound suspicion of what they see as kind of newfangled progressive techniques and an explicit hostility towards competency-based, capability-based approaches to the curriculum. And we haven't yet seen the playing out of that. I have myself tried to engage in a conversation with Michael Gove and posed him a set of questions which he promised to answer me 4 months ago, 3 months ago, 2 months ago, and I'm still waiting. So when I hear, you can read my blog. As soon as I know, I'll tell you. But there's still something to be worked out in that regard. But because we are poised at that moment, it's why we have come to think that what was the great strength of Opening Minds which was its adaptability to local circumstance and the way that each school makes its own curriculum using the framework, that it is a framework, not a prescription. It could, if we're not careful, become its weakness. Julian said that there's 220 schools that say that they're doing some form of opening minds, and we think that a pretty high proportion of them are doing some really fascinating work and really interesting work. But there are others that are not, and there is therefore a vulnerability if people say this practice isn't good, if people are applying the practice in a sloppy way. So we've got to make sure that where we're applying approaches like opening minds, we're applying them in a really rigorous way. And of course, the weakness often with the kind of progressive practice in the past has been a lack of rigor. I can't remember the name of the academic. I'm sure there are people who can remember the academic who concluded that the problem with child-centered learning in the 1960s was that probably only about half a dozen schools did proper child-centered learning. Everyone else did a kind of highly kind of watered down, not very well thought through, not very rigorous version of this, which then meant that that whole kind of movement was discredited. So we need to learn from that experience. And as we have more freedom, in at least the short to medium term, and possibly in the longer term with the Conservatives, it's also important to demonstrate that that freedom is being used to bring tangible benefits for learners. So that's why we've been increasingly wanting to try to understand what is it that makes opening minds work well. So in a sense, we're in the second stage of opening minds. The first stage was about making it available to schools, publicising it to schools, and it is in a way quite remarkable, 220 plus schools without any kind of support from government, without any marketing budget from the RSA, have adopted this way of working. But I think now it's time for a second stage, which is when we get to understand what are the success factors for opening minds. Why does it work so well in some schools and why does it work less well in others? And we think the heart of that is whether or not schools see opening minds as a whole school approach. It seems to us to be less successful when schools see it as something which can be bolted on or as something which can be used because there's a particular problem in a particular part of the school, a particular part of the curriculum. Instead, it needs to be a whole school approach. Indeed, one of the consultants we're working with in looking at the lessons of opening minds says that one of the questions he asks is at a secondary school level, that one of the questions he asks to get an initial impression of whether opening minds have been implemented adequately is he rings up the school receptionist and asks them whether they've heard of opening minds. And if they have, that's a very good sign. And if they haven't, it's not such a good sign. It's an interesting starting point. We're also moving towards a light touch, peer-to-peer system of accrediting opening minds schools, and we want opening minds schools to mean something beyond the fact that the school is using the opening minds approach. We want opening minds schools to be part of a learning network, of a movement, if you like. It's not just a different way of doing the curriculum; it's a different way of thinking about education. It's a commitment to rigor. It's a commitment to a different set of aspirations, and it's a commitment, as I say, to mutual support. One of the things we want opening mind schools to commit to is the fact that they will support other schools who also adopt opening minds, and they will learn from each other. Opening mind schools, we are clear, are stronger when they work together. And one of the ways in which we are trying to help that happen is we've created an opening minds online platform so that schools can exchange practice and learn as they go along. Other innovations, as we've been doing some work with subject specialist groups and looking at opening minds and looking at the particular relationship between opening minds and those subjects. But the other point I want to make is that just like a bicycle, if a curriculum is not moving forward, it will start to fall over. And we have to therefore think about where does opening minds go next? In a way, as I said at the beginning of my comments, the rest of the education debate has kind of caught up with opening minds where it was a few years ago. And so we're thinking hard about the developments for opening minds, and I want to just mention a couple of those, and they're related. The first is work that we're doing around what we call the area-based curriculum, and the idea there is that, which is linked, of course, to notions of practical learning and for young people to see the relevance of their learning. The idea there is that we need more of what is taught in schools to relate to the world in which children live in outside schools. Now that's a kind of obvious thing to say, and an awful lot of project work in primary schools and secondary schools, of course, does make that link between what children are learning and the world in which they inhabit. But actually the idea is more radical than that, and the idea is that over time what we would like to see is we'd like to see the wider community sharing responsibility for the school curriculum, understanding what is taught in schools and being committed to helping to provide that. So our work in Manchester around this idea of area-based curriculum involves local institutions in Manchester providing opportunities for young people to visit and to understand their work. But the vision we've got for the kind of long term is that we would like to see, for example, if you're thinking about work around health, that it would be the local primary care trust or local hospitals that would work with schools in that locality on helping to design the kinds of materials that young people might use, visits to health service facilities, so that young people really understand what's going on around them and they're getting incredibly exciting and rich material which they can use in their learning. So the idea of the area-based curriculum is one direction that we want to take Opening Minds. And the other direction, which is very much related to that, is an idea which we term schools without boundaries, which is looking at how it is schools can influence the kind of culture that children are in most of their time. One of the points that we often make is that schools, children spend 20% of their waking hours in schools. And we know from all kinds of psychological research that if children are not receptive to learning when they arrive at school, and of course you all know this, if they don't come from a culture where there's an expectation of learning, then what you can achieve in that 20% is, well, it's circumscribed. You are in the position of a kind of British Leyland. Many of you are too young to know what I'm talking about when I say British Leyland, but older ones will recognise the reference. You're kind of in the position of a British Leyland worker in the 1970s who finds themselves controlling a little tiny bit of the conveyor belt, and something comes down the conveyor belt to you and it's in a terrible state, and you've got this little bit of the conveyor belt to do whatever you can before you pass it along the conveyor belt. And that's kind of unsatisfactory. And it means what you do is you do more and more in that 20%, and it's a kind of intense and mad process to try and achieve what you can. Now that's, in our view, not a kind of sustainable way of working. And so we think that schools have to think, and many schools, of course, do this in very interesting ways already, have to think about how schools can better see that they are an incredible resource, human capital, social capital, physical capital, to create a culture of learning and confidence about learning in the communities in which they operate. Now, some schools kind of do this, but it still happens too often as a kind of last resort. Liam Byrne, the Cabinet Minister, was on this platform a few weeks ago talking about a school in his constituency where they had a group of Bangladeshi boys who were consistently underperforming. They tried every single form of intensification in school. It was only when they engaged the parents of those boys and indeed started teaching the parents of some of those boys that suddenly their performance was completely transformed. So we're also interested in the idea that Opening Minds as part of a whole school approach also leads schools to start to think more creatively about how it is they can use their resources to create the kind of culture which means that children get the right messages reinforced outside school, which means they arrive in school ready to learn and with an expectation of learning, so that the 20% that you've got can be used more creatively and doesn't feel like this kind of desperate attempt to do something in a very small amount of intense time. So, the point I'm making in summary, the 3 points I'm making, is that this is a particularly important moment in the education debate, and that those of us who are committed to a kind of broad agenda of looking at the whole child, or looking at the child in relation to the wider community, thinking about a capabilities approach to children, need not just to make that case, as it were, in the kind of policy area, but we need to make sure that our practice demonstrates that that works, and we have to recognise that this will be a time when if the practice isn't good, it will come under greater scrutiny. The second point is that what we're trying to do with Opening Minds, and in asking you to think about being part of Opening Minds, is that it's no longer just a framework, but it's a network and it's an approach, and that we'll be trying to bring, without all the kind of panoply of Ofsted and all of that kind of stuff, bringing greater rigour, but particularly more support and collaboration to the Opening Minds framework. And then thirdly, that Opening Minds is a living idea, and that we're pleased at the progress, delighted at the progress that's been made over the last few years, but that progress will only be maintained if we can continue to develop new ideas and to work with you and to understand your best practice as we take that approach forward. So, as Julian said, you're going to have a fantastic day. You've now heard from the two people you're going to hear from throughout the whole day who know least about education. So you're just sitting there thinking, why do I have to listen to these people? Why can't I listen to someone who knows what they're talking about? The lack of expertise finishes now. Everybody now knows what they're talking about. But thank you for tolerating me.